So we're picking up with Paul, and he's got kind of to remind ourselves of where we've been. So Paul has a new crew, and so Barnabas and John Mark have gone back to Cyprus, and so he has picked up Silas as kind of his main co-evangelist and his main partner, and then Timothy as kind of the apprentice of the group, and they've started going around. They kind of hit the churches that they were been to before, that Paul has been to before, and then we have a transition in the ministry where, in starting with verse 6, they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So, passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. So, what has just happened? Basically, first of all, you see how the Holy Spirit has become much more, in a sense, urgently and decisively involved in getting Paul to kind of get where God wants him to go. And where does God want him to go? Into Europe. Basically, he crosses the channel from modern-day Turkey into Greece, into the district of Macedonia. So it's a kind of so Paul has literally kind of moved onto a new continent, and the mission is coming ever closer to the ends of the earth, as Acts chapter 1 verse 8 would say. Remember, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And so we have this kind of further expansion into the continent of Asia. The third thing is, you might have noticed in verse 10, a first person plural as opposed to a third person plural. It's the beginning of the famous we passages of the book of Acts. And so what this leads us to believe is that Luke got picked up in Troas. So, that there really does seem to be, in a sense, Luke has kind of joined the mission team in Troas, and from now on, it's going to be, we're going to have things narrated to us as a we did this, we did that, we went here, we went there. So it's just a delightful little kind of rhetorical tell that it's like, okay, well, that's where it went. So now Luke has expanded his entourage yet more. And in a sense, one wonders if Luke has been added to the team because somehow Paul feels that Luke will be of benefit to a European mission. Or perhaps one would say the Holy Spirit let Paul know that Luke would be beneficial to a European mission. So he grabs up Luke, and then off we go. And in verse 11, we set sail from Troas and took a straight course, or another way to translate the Greek is we made a straight run to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, and the letter to the Philippians. And so we have the record of a church there. So in this being unheard words, we're going to skip over this section because in the lectionary, chapter 16 of Acts actually gets a great deal of representation because of the narrative power of the stories of Paul's entry into that city. But I can't pass by without noting a couple things because we've been kind of moving through looking at the journey of Paul through Acts in a more systematic and narrative way. and it's kind of in a sermon, there are some things that, you don't necessarily spend a whole lot of time on in a sermon, but we can spend lots of time here. So they go to Philippi, which is the leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. So here we have yet another cultural frontier, a specifically, not just Greek, but a specifically Roman community. So it's a Roman colony, and the way that Roman colonies were formed, typically in the Greco-Roman world, would be that there would be a garrison there, and if the garrison stayed long enough, the soldiers basically would retire. If you spent 20 years in the Legion, you were guaranteed basically a farm and citizenship. So basically, if the garrison stayed somewhere for a long enough period of time, they would all of a sudden, over time, you get kind of ex-soldier farmers who would be popping up around the garrison, and soon enough, it'd become a city. What would really set a colony off on a great foot would be, and what the city of Philippi managed to do, is if you get a grant from the central government, and you say, Caesar, we want to form a colony in your honor, and we'll build a wonderful temple to you. And so that's what they did. So they built a temple. There's a temple to Caesar in Philippi, and they got a large kind of grant from Rome to, kind of build the city and its infrastructure and all those wonderful things that the Romans brought to civilization, like aqueducts. Roads and aqueducts and all those things that they talk about in Monty Python's The Life of Brian. So then you have, so he's there on a Sabbath day. We went outside the gate by the river where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. So what's going on here is sometimes in these kind of pagan cities, the Jewish synagogue would be built outside the city walls. That is, the city itself was so, in a sense, pagan for Jewish sensibilities, that they would actually say, you know what, we can't even build a synagogue in this place without being like right next to a temple of Athena or something, or a temple of Mars, or to a temple of Caesar. So we're going to build our place outside the city walls, down by the river, by a water source, which would be great for the Jews in rites of purification, right? So they would have a place where they could do some religious ritual involving water. And so they're on their way to the place of prayer, and they run across a group of women who we think are basically the men would be inside the synagogue and the women would be outside having their own time of prayer. So Paul runs into the kind of the ECW of the synagogue of Philippi, and so he meets in verse 14 a certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. So this is a big deal, because Lydia, Luke wants you to know by these little details, he wants you to know that Lydia is a woman of substance in the Greco-Roman world. So she's a dealer in purple cloth, which is a very rare and valuable luxury commodity. In a sense, it's not like Lydia herself would wear the product, but if you sell the product, right, it's like you have a certain lifestyle. So it's like you can't afford the goods you're selling, but you're making a good living off selling the stuff. So this would be a kind of person that Lydia would be. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. So right there, the idea that Lydia would be a householder in her own right, that's something worth remarking upon. Right? It wouldn't be she brought them to her husband's home, and their husband would say, "Come on in." So if you remember, Peter stayed at Simon the tanner's house and then went to Cornelius's house. But here we're at Lydia's house, and that is a rare thing in the Greco-Roman world. It was very unusual. And this house was large enough that not only does she have a house, she has an oikonomia, that is a household. Right? She's got people, she's got servants, she has an establishment. So it's big enough, basically, that Paul and his entourage can stay there without scandal. Right? It's not like she has like a tiny little hut, and Paul and you guys come into my little hut over here. That's not what's going on. Lydia has a large enough establishment that, you know, Paul and his group can stay in the servants' quarters or wherever they're going to be, and there is plenty of room for everybody. So that just gives you an indication that, and Luke wants you to know that the gospel has now reached a new demographic, if you will, within the Greco-Roman world. That is, the gospel has been attractive to a woman of means within the Greco-Roman world, and the woman responds in faith to Paul's message with generous hospitality, and becomes, in a sense, a source of support for Paul and his mission in Philippi. So, in a sense, once you've got an address, you know, the thing with the Greco-Roman world, it's not necessarily is not unlike in some ways our world. That is, you can't just show up at a city and not have a place to stay, right? You know, and then you know you'll get picked up for vagrancy, right? You know, it's like, you know, so you have to have an address. And so what Lydia with her household provides to the apostolic entourage is an address at Philippi, kind of a place to stay and a place to be anchored. So that gives them the opportunity not just to pass through, but to actually stay and build a church there. So thus the letter to the Philippians, right? So there's a substantial. Paul has stayed there long enough to have a substantial enough church that he remains in correspondence with it, or at least a church wealthy enough, i.e. read Lydia, that can preserve Paul's correspondence for future generations. See, this is the key thing. You know, Paul might have written letters to the church in Iconium, to Antioch in Pisidia, and to these other places, but if the church was too small or poor, they wouldn't have been able to maintain Paul's letters beyond the originals, right? You know, it takes a lot of work. You would have to hire scribes, you have to buy the sheepskin. I mean, maintaining manuscripts and passing them down was not an easy thing to do. So the fact is that you had to have a church with enough material means to provide what you might call the infrastructure of evangelical remembrance. Okay, so you know they had to have the wherewithal to preserve these texts. So then you have the story of the slave girl of Philippi, which again this is preached upon and it's read on a Sunday. So I'm gonna skip through that. And basically, Paul, to the fact that in the paragraph 19 through 24, Paul and Silas are basically there's a riot begins. So if you in verse 19, but when the Philippian slave girl, when her owner saw that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. So now that we're in Greco-Roman territory, the agora is going to be more and more featured in this narrative as a scene of action. So they drag them to the agora, they're kind of like the public square, more or less. And when they brought them before the magistrates, they said, "These men are disturbing our city. They are Jews and are advocating customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to adopt or observe." So you'll notice in a sense, the double indemnity that the church is functioning under. That is, local Jewish populations would be angry with them for, in a sense, being something other than Jewish, right? In a sense, you're bringing something that's this isn't Judaism, and so they would haul them up as disturbers of the peace for like, hey, we don't know who these guys are. They're disturbing the peace of our synagogue. Then when they go to a place like this Roman colony, where there are no Jews in the city or very few, they get accused of basically it's an anti-Semitic charge. They're Jews and they're doing Jewish stuff here in a Roman city. That's not allowed. We have them build their synagogue over there, and now they're here in the city. They're not allowed to be doing that. So you see how the early Christian movement really had to thread the needle, and really didn't always do so successfully, between the Jewish communities that they were trying to win converts from and the Gentile communities that they were trying to win converts from. And for different reasons, both of these communities could easily become hostile to the apostolic movement. So basically, they get hauled up because they're Jews or perceived to be Jews, and the crowd joined in attacking them. And the magistrates had them stripped of their clothing and ordered them to be beaten with rods. After they had given them a severe flogging, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to keep them securely. Following these instructions, he put them in the innermost cell and fastened their feet in stocks. So for those of you who've seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's take, you've seen what a beating with rods. So basically with Jesus, the kind of the first thing that the Roman soldiers do to Jesus is a rod beating. And and it is not pretty. It is a very, very severe test. And so the police were called, the name of the police in the Greco-Roman world were called the rod bearers. These were the guys who they walked around town with their staves, and these were the ones that they would use to give the kind of the public beatings. For the essentially judicial torture. So so Luke notes that it was a severe beating, a severe flogging, and afterwards they're thrown into prison. And then, in a sense, the added torture of restraint. So basically, if you put someone in the stocks, you're essentially torturing them by prohibiting them from moving or seeking any sort of relief. These are tactics that continue to be used today, right? So, you put somebody in a little box and you keep them there for 24 hours. That's not a pleasant place to spend 24 hours. So in the same way, Paul and Silas and Timothy are in for a pretty rough night in the jail of Philippi. So now this is a theme. So we're going to have something that should really bring to mind some earlier incidents from Acts. So in verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. So first of all, just note the difference in conduct, right? That, good old Peter, he slept. I mean, Peter, he slept. He figured he's going to be executed. I love that. I mean, you got to love that about Peter. He's going to be executed by Herod the next day, and he gets a good night's sleep, and the angel has to, kick him awake, right? So, but Peter and Silas, they spend the night singing hymns. And so what Luke is really bringing forward here is that there's a, and again, for Luke's Greek audience, this would be, Luke wants to bring this behavior forward because this would testify to their stoic fortitude, right? They're kind of, they would, in a sense, Paul and Silas are playing the part of the persecuted philosopher, right? Who bears up under their punishment with, strength of character and resolve. And so the Greeks would be all about this. And so they're praying and singing hymns to God, but again, with a Jewish twist. So it's kind of Greek, kind of philosophical stoicism with a Jewish messianic twist, where they're actually praying to Yahweh, to the God of and Father of Jesus Christ, and singing hymns, which would be the Psalms. And of course, if you've been praying the Psalms with me, on the online Abbey, a lot of those Psalms are about the innocent, righteous sufferer, at the hands of the wicked. And, God do something about these wicked people, you know, and so let's see what God does. Suddenly, there was an earthquake so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were unfastened. When the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors wide open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, since he supposed that the prisoners had escaped. So do you remember what Herod does to the soldiers after Peter escapes, right? He summons them and then sends them off to be executed. So the jailer can expect similar treatment. So instead of being tortured to death, he's getting ready to fall on his sword. Paul shouts out in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, we're all here." The jailer called for lights, and rushing in, he fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them outside and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They answered, "Believe on the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." They spoke to the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And so again, that kind of term of art for the gospel. You know, they preach the gospel of Jesus. They speak the word of the Lord to him. At the same hour of the night, he took them and washed their wounds. Then he and his entire family were baptized without delay. I mean, and so this just is such a wonderful kind of repetition and recapitulation, and yet with new twists of the familiar story we've seen since the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip, you know, here's water, what does prevent me from being baptized? And then Peter at Cornelius' house, where the Holy Spirit falls upon them and immediately they baptize the whole household, even up to Lydia, the purple dye merchant, who is baptized with her whole household. Now we have the jailer. And this is Luke's narrative. This is the power of Luke's narrative for the gospel. That is, what Luke does by relating these two stories about the church in Philippi isn't it remarkable? And this is part of Luke's message, that the gospel is attractive to people from the top to the bottom of society. I mean, if you think about it, a jailer is a pretty rough character in a town. I mean, he's responsible for torturing people. I mean, that is his job. That's how he makes a living, is he manages all these people in the stocks. And so you have Lydia, the purple dye merchant, who's out there at the river praying, and she listens to Paul's message, and then she comes to faith, and she offers Paul hospitality, right? She says, "Paul, come over and stay at my house." And in a sense, the jailer offers Paul a sort of paradoxically different hospitality, doesn't he? I mean, Paul and Silas enter into his house and enjoy his hospitality, not quite in the same way as with Lydia, but in the end, doesn't the jailer come through? He washes their wounds and begins to care for them and basically gives them first aid. And so, in a sense, the jailer comes around and is able to offer hospitality in his own way. And again, I think it's just this beautiful picture of how the gospel, the redemptive power of the gospel, can redeem even God's enemies. And that how this enemy love is something that basically Paul in the stocks is proved more powerful than the local magistracy at Philippi, right? Because Paul has God on his side, right? And so if that's what it takes, God's going to send an earthquake. You know, that's what God's going to do, whatever God has to do to free his people and to see his mission extended. And so that's what Paul has in his kind of corner pocket, you know, or little vest pocket. He can, you know, he knows he has God at his back, so they can sing hymns in the middle of the night after they've been tortured, because they have that supreme confidence in their own vindication. So then in verse 34, he brought them up into the house, right? So they're out of the cellar. He brings them up to the household level where, you know, the non-prisoners live, and set food before them. And he and his entire household rejoiced that he had become a believer in God. Wow. I mean, what a powerful story of redemption. And again, they're read on different Sundays. So you hear about Lydia on one Sunday and then the jailer on another. But if you kind of keep them all together, has kind of this the Paul at Philippi has a unit. You can really see what Luke is trying to do in his storytelling here. He's trying to show you that the gospel basically can go everywhere and anywhere. But there still is the matter of Paul technically being a prisoner. And so Luke is going to have to spring him out of jail. So how is Paul going to get out of the jail in Philippi? So morning comes. The magistrates sent the police, literally here the word is the rod bearers. So basically they send the guys who gave him the first beating and saying, let those men go. And the jailer reported the message to Paul saying, the magistrates sent word to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace. But Paul replied, they have beaten us in public, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And now are they going to discharge us in secret? Certainly not. Let them come and take us out themselves. I just think this is good old Paul. You have to imagine, like, really, we think he's really a small guy. So you can just imagine this kind of small, kind of pipsqueak of a guy just saying, you know what? If they want us out of here, you tell those magistrates they come drag us out themselves. I mean, I just love it. That's chutzpah, right? You know, so, and this, by the way, is not going to be the first or the last time that Paul invokes his status as a Roman citizen. In fact, ultimately, that's what's going to get him brought to Rome itself, is that in the end, he's going to appeal his case to the emperor, and that's what's going to set him on his course to his eventual martyrdom in Rome. But this is kind of like the first time that Luke documents that Paul kind of throws out the Roman citizen card. Like, by the way, did you know that I'm a Roman citizen? Now, you have to understand, because it says the next, when they heard, the police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. Why were they afraid? Because Roman law, one of the key benefits of being a Roman citizen was that basically the state was not allowed to harm your body, right? That in a sense, as a Roman citizen, you could be fined, right, for his various civil infractions, but you could not be corporally punished. That was a privilege that Roman citizens had. You know, all those slave peoples, you know, they could be scourged and flogged and crucified, but Roman citizens, so even Paul, they had to be tried and they would be beheaded, you know, killed like civilized people. So, so when Paul says, hey, listen, by the way, you've beaten a Roman citizen, under Roman law, the magistrates and the rod bearers would be liable to the same punishment that they just dealt out to Paul. So, you know, this is a harsh society. I mean, this is a tough place to be. You know, I mean, remember, you know, jailers get killed when they lose their prisoners. It's not something like they send the marshals. Well, they do send the marshals, but after they kill the jailers. So, you know, so the magistrates had every reason at this point to be terrified because, you know, Paul's like, okay, you know, I could complain about this. It is a Roman colony. I could just go down the road and report on you all. So they were afraid. And so then in verse 39, so they came and apologized to them. Now you have to understand that an apology in this culture is not just, hey, my bad, you know, here are a few dollars, you know, go on your way. To apologize is a major loss of face. It is a shaming ritual, right? I mean, so basically what happens is that Paul's honor as a Greco-Roman guy, his honor is vindicated because these magistrates basically have to all come and grovel in front of Paul to keep him from turning them all in, right? So so again, this is, Luke wants to tell you the story because it is somewhat humorous. I mean, not humorous that Paul gets beaten with an inch of life, but Luke wants you to see the irony of the fact that those who thought that they were in power and in control of the situation are now the roles are completely reversed. And Paul, the powerless one, is now in total control of the situation. So now they grovel to Paul. So what does Paul do? He leaves them be, right? He accepts the apology. They took him out and asked him to leave the city. But he does not leave the city. Instead, in verse 4, it says, after the leaving prison, they went to Lydia's home. And when they had seen and encouraged the brothers and sisters there, then they departed. So this is for Paul, that's a show of Paul's independence. Like, I'm not going to go just because you tell me to go. I'm going to take my own sweet time. I'm going to go back to Lydia's house, right, where I live. And when I'm good and ready, I'm going to leave town. And so that's what he does. And so this is Paul really asserting his dignity in the face of this. In some ways, this is Paul living out Jesus's injunction to turn the other cheek. That is, to turn the other cheek is, that in that culture, you strike an equal with an open palm. Right. So, and if I'm right, and everybody's right-handed, so you have to assume, right hand. So open palm, but if you strike an inferior, it's with the back of your palm, right? And so you would strike, coming across, and so when you would turn the other cheek, it meant you're going to have to, you can strike me again, but this time it's going to be as an equal, right? You're going to have to do an open-handed strike. And so what Paul is basically what Jesus is saying is, you don't strike back, but you can assert your dignity, right? You don't reply with violence, but you say, I'm a human being and I have a dignity that is absolutely equal to yours. And to find a way to do that, right? So, and that's the art of being a Christian, is to find a way to turn the other cheek. I think, someone who did it masterfully well in context would have been the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the South in the 50s and 60s. I mean, that the whole civil rights movement of that era were absolute experts at turning the other cheek, in a sense, receiving violent treatment in such a way that their fundamental dignity as human persons was actually enhanced, not diminished, by the treatment that they were receiving at the hands of the municipal authorities, like Paul is here in the municipal authorities. So in a sense, that's what's going on here. And so Paul says, I'll leave when I'm good and ready. He goes to Lydia's home, and after they encourage the brothers and sisters, and once again, this is what a vision for the Christian life, that someone who's basically been beaten with rods and put in the stocks, that you would go to the church and encourage them in that circumstance. I mean, that's the upside down of the power of the gospel. That's the upside down power of the Holy Spirit, that you can be beaten with an inch of your life, and that, in a sense, has now qualified you to be an encourager. To say, guess what just happened at that jail? The last time you guys saw me, I was getting beaten with rods. I was getting a good flogging. But, let me tell you about that jailer. By the way, he's going to be coming to church next Sunday. It's like, so be ready. That jailer, he's not coming here to arrest you. He's actually coming here because he's going to be part of your family. So, I just love that. Just those little throwaway sentences that Luke gives, but really tells us so much about what the ethos of Paul and the early church was. Okay, so we move on into chapter 17, which is unread. I'm going to check my chat. Okay, nothing on the chat. Okay, we're moving forward then. Okay. So chapter 17. After Paul and Silas had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. Well, that should be a very familiar town to you, because we have a letter from Thessalonica. And the fact is that really from the point of when Luke comes into the story at Troas, from this place all through this entire missionary journey that lasts into like chapter 21, is really the most well-documented part of the whole book of Acts, because we really can, and in this part, we really can map this out with Paul's letters and really say, oh, yes, he talks about that in the letter to the Thessalonians. Oh, right, there's the Philippian church, and he talks about being a prisoner for the Lord, right? The Philippians church is a famous one where he talks about, being a prisoner for the Lord, and they would know exactly what he was talking about because he had been a prisoner in Philippi. So they go to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days, is the NRSV says argued, but it's more like debated. It's it's kind of a word that indicates philosophical debate. Argued with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, "This is the Messiah, Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you." So a couple things here. So first of all, we see that Paul re-ups on his old practice of going to the synagogue first, right? So it says he's back in a town with the Jewish synagogue. He goes straight to the Jews and he begins his mission there. So I just want to highlight that even though Paul has had difficulties with Jewish synagogues in the first missionary trip, he still goes at it again. He still will go into this synagogue in Thessalonica. And we also really, in this kind of little capsule form, in verse 3, really gives you the 2-part summary of Paul's, what it meant to preach the word of the Lord to the Jews. That is, he has to, number one, he has to prove scripturally, he has to explain and prove that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer, right? That in a sense to the Jews, because that would have been, as you might have heard in other sermons, that was not the expectation of Second Temple Judaism, but that the Messiah would come and suffer. The Messiah was going to come and liberate, right? The Messiah was going to be a figure of great power, but that the Messiah would suffer has to be proven. And so Paul has his proof text, which frankly, you get a lot of when you read the Gospels, meaning the 4 Gospels, right? The Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. The Gospels in some ways are an expansion of the argument that the Messiah had to suffer, right? When Mark and Matthew and Luke, each of them tell you that Jesus in 3 different places and 3 different times says, the Son of Man must be betrayed, suffer, be killed, and on the 3rd day rise again. What they're trying to tell you is, this is what we've been trying to argue for the last 30 years to the Jewish people, right? That Jesus himself said this had to happen. And the Gospels include some of those proof texts that from the Old Testament that talk about the vocation of the suffering servant. So basically, that's who Jesus self-identifies as, the suffering servant in the book of Isaiah. And so Paul's going to go to those texts, which we're so familiar with from the Gospels, and from, for that matter, from the prophet Isaiah, right? And bring those in. And so you have to prove that the Messiah is going to suffer and rise from the dead, and then you have to prove that basically this Messiah is Jesus, right? So in a sense, you have to make an abstract claim and prove the abstract claim that when the Messiah comes, he will suffer. And by the way, we've already got a guy who did that. His name is Jesus, and this is how it happened, right? So it's really a 2-part proof, right? And they're of course related, but what this little verse in verse 3, what it really helps us understand is how those 2 things got pulled apart in Paul's own mind. What did Paul have to do when he stepped into a synagogue? So, again, as someone who is in the business of preaching and proclaiming the gospel, it's fascinating to me just to say, okay, here's what Paul had to do when he basically made his case to and sometimes a hostile crowd. You know, what did he have to overcome? And again, I have it easy. I mean, typically the people who come to church actually want to hear something, right? So Paul, he's making cold calls. I mean, these are hard sales calls. I mean, these are like, I'm calling you up and I'm like, you know, can I talk to you about your extended warranty? I mean, this is a tough call for Paul to make. You know, he's got to go in there, and these people have no idea about what has happened back in Jerusalem 30 years ago, or 20 years prior to when Paul walks into their town. And he has to explain to them that this event 20 years ago has total existential significance for them right now today. By the way, the only way that I get close to this kind of experience is when I try to do confirmation classes for 8th graders. That's as close as I get to Paul going in to Thessalonica to the synagogue, okay? So, and it's when I do that, I was like, okay, now I'm living in, Lord. Thank you for the opportunity to understand Paul's predicament and what I have to overcome to sell Jesus to 8th graders, okay? So it's a tough sell sometimes. All right, so moving along, we probably should. Okay, we'll move along. Verse 4, some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. The word for joined is actually, can be translated committed to. And it's an absolutely fascinating word. It's basically, it's in a sense, it's almost like an enlistment, right? They enlisted with Paul and Silas. They are leaving team synagogue and becoming team ecclesia, right? They are committing to a new family, a new experience. So some of them were persuaded, and as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women, which is, again, that's a Lucan latotes, right? So not a few meant a lot of the leading women. And again, Luke, so this is Luke. We always think like Luke is keyed in to the presence of women in his gospel. He of all the gospels, he is most keyed in to the women who follow Jesus and to women's experiences. And so here he is in the Acts of the Apostles indicating that actually women were a key part of those a key constituency of those who responded to Paul's message. And again, you don't necessarily have to, for all the bad rap that Christianity frankly gets in modern American culture, the fact that it was people who were on the margins that did respond, like the God-fearing Gentiles, people who wanted to know God, wanted to belong to God's people, but would never really fully be members. And then you have Jewish women who, again, would not be fully incorporated into synagogue worship, but were incorporated into the worship of the apostolic church. And so these groups respond to the message of Jesus that Paul is preaching in a particularly powerful way, right? In a sense, God-fearing Gentiles and Jewish women with some knowledge of the scriptures were key constituencies, both rich districts for Paul. So, he would, those are where he would draw a lot of his converts from. But, oh dear, there's that but. The Jews became jealous, which again, this has happened already like 3 or 4 times, right? And again, what is the jealousy of the Jews is because the message is through Jesus Messiah, through trusting in Jesus Messiah's achievement on the cross and his vindication in the resurrection, you can become a part of God's elect people, right? And the Jews, the opponents of that message were like, no, you can't. You cannot become a part of the chosen people. That's us. It is not up for sale. It's not up for discussion. There are no back doors, there are no side doors, and you can't get in the front door. I'm sorry, because we're bouncing you. It's like, that's what it means that the Jews got jealous. They rejected that message in the strongest possible terms. And so here's something but here's a new element. So those Jews of Thessalonica, with the help of, you gotta have, it depends on, I wonder how it's translated in different books. Now the NRSV says ruffians. Now that's a word you don't hear in everyday English anymore, really. It's like, maybe we should bring ruffians back. You know, it's like, we should just use that word more. You know, just ruffians. You know, it's like, they're ruffians going to rallies, you know, those ruffians. And so really the Greek word is really more translated like basically lowlifes. You know, it's like, you know, the NRSV does really clean things up. But it's really, Luke is saying, basically the riffraff, you know, these lowlifes, and who are hanging out where? In the marketplace, in the agora. And so basically these would be your typical kind of like the guys who are leaning against the wall at 2 p.m. and with nothing to do, looking for trouble. And so basically what happened, I mean, is they've been with us in every time and every age and every place, right? So they're like, they're the people who are hanging around just waiting for something bad to happen to be a part of. And so basically these folks come around and say, hey, you know, give a few denarii, you know, spread a few denarii around, and all of a sudden, look what you got, you have a mob, right? So now you have a mob action. So some of the lowlifes or ruffians in the marketplaces, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. While they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly, the word for there is the demos, where we get democracy from. But they wanted to basically bring them out into the town square, and it looks like a lynching is about to happen. They are basically got a big mob going. They're really angry. They're searching town for Paul and Silas. They want to bring them out in front of the crowd and have a trial right there in the marketplace, right there in the agora, and kind of settle this right away. So they attacked Jason's house. And so because they evidently knew that Jason was staying there. By the way, Paul mentions in Romans chapter 16, verse 21, his passing greetings from his associate, one of his favorite associates, Jason. So we have Jason is attested in Paul's letter to the Romans as a key ally and associate. So they were staying at Jason's house, which indicates that in 3 weeks, remember, Paul's been there for 3 Sabbaths. So Jason's house is kind of like Lydia's house. It's kind of like the headquarters, and it's his home address in Thessalonica. And there's already a house church that is popped up there. And so when they couldn't, basically Paul and Silas, for whatever reason, weren't home at Jason's house, or maybe they ran away. It's just basically they couldn't find them. So then they dragged Jason. Like, okay, we can't find Paul and Silas. So then they dragged Jason and some of the believers before the city authorities, shouting, "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also." Now, you have to, the NRSV translates it turning the world upside down, but the Greek for the world is the oikonomai, which is was also a slangy term for the empire. Basically, they're subverting the empire. So in Philippi, they had an anti-Semitic slur levied at them, and here in Thessalonica, they're labeled subverters of the empire. And again, especially the charge of subverting the empire should remind us of Jesus's trial. If you don't crucify him, you're no friend of Caesar's. Right? He said he's a king, and so the fact is, so Paul has been trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. That's the word that's used right there in chapter 17, verse 3, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. And so basically the way this kind of gets spun is they're subverting the empire and the claims of Caesar. So he spells it out further in verse 7. And Jason has entertained them as guests. They are all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus. So in a sense, the charge is true. That is precisely what Paul is saying. There is another king named Jesus. He's Jesus Messiah. That's Paul's name for him, is Jesus Messiah. Jesus, N.T. Wright translates it kind of basically King Jesus, right? And I've come here to talk to you about King Jesus. And, it takes some unpacking, of course, to understand how this king is different from the Caesar who sits on a throne in Rome. But nevertheless, this King Jesus does have claims on those who would be citizens of his kingdom. Remember in the letter to the Philippians, he says, our citizenship is not from here, our citizenship is in heaven. So Paul himself could tread dangerously in the empire by using concepts like citizenship, kingdom. These are words that would be, so it's like, did he just say what I think he said, that we're not citizens? Or, what does that play here? If we're not citizens of Rome, where are we citizens? So they pick up on some of that language and they start to have a mob. The people in the city officials were disturbed when they heard this. And after they had taken bail from Jason and the others, they let them go. So interestingly, because they don't have hands on Paul and Silas, who are out-of-towners, they basically, Jason, because he's from there, he, in a sense, he has the protection of the city. I mean, he's a local. And so they basically, okay, give us some bail assurance, give us some bail money, and we'll let you go. That very night, the brothers, or the believers, sent Paul and Silas off to Beroea. And when they arrived, they went to the Jewish synagogue. So once again, Paul has to beat an embarrassing retreat, and they kind of spirit Paul and Silas away. It's like, and they leave town in the dead of night. It would be this sort of thing, this precise sort of thing, that in the letter in the Corinthian correspondence, you can see that Paul's opponents within the church used against him. Basically, their line of argument against Paul's apostolic authority was, this guy gets himself into trouble everywhere. He gets beaten, he gets run out of town, he has to run out in the dead of night to escape. He cannot be, if King Jesus is as great as he says he is, surely his ambassador would be a more respectable figure. And that's why Paul, when he has to justify his authority, says, but do you remember how I preached to you Christ crucified? It's like that. He says, that's the side of King Jesus that I'm here to represent to you. And all my troubles and all my sufferings and my beatings and having to run away, it basically to spare the local church trouble. So they know that if they can get Paul and Silas out of town, the mob, the mob basically will dissipate. They've got nobody to take their anger out on. And so they spirit him away. Paul says, this is the part of Jesus' life that I'm here to represent, is a crucified king. A king whose Jesus embraced the shame, embraced the humiliation that the world had to offer. And so as his apostle, how can I expect to do any different? And that becomes, in a sense, Paul's own self-identity as the suffering follower of the suffering servant. So they send them off to the Jewish authorities, and then they go to the Jewish synagogue. Remember, so good old Paul, he's just going to keep going. He goes right back to a Jewish synagogue. These Jews were more, now in the NRSV it says receptive, but the Greek word is noble. So these Jews were more noble, again, from a Greek philosophical point of view. They're more noble. How do we know they're more noble than the ones in Thessalonica? Well, they welcomed the message very eagerly. Well, that proves your nobility. Well, you're a very well-born person if you receive the message of the gospel eagerly. Yes, of course. And examine the scriptures every day to see whether these things were so. So here you have kind of a good-bad contrast between the Jews of Thessalonica and the Jews of Beroea. That in Berea, they are willing to examine the scriptures. They're willing to actually look into the scriptures and read with Paul and kind of follow his argument. And so as a result of that, in verse 12, many of them therefore believed, including not a few, there's that latotes again, not a few who, Greek women and men of high standing, not just any, but high standing. So Luke, again, this is one of the things where we can be a little bit embarrassed by Luke's clear joy in the fact that the gospel is attracting kind of high-profile adherents. Right? I mean, it's a very human thing to do. It's like, we have a senator in our church. It's like, it's kind of, it's like kind of that sort of thing, and he's pointing out to his Greek audience that respectable people are coming to this after all. So you all, in a sense, don't have to be embarrassed about this missionary movement that you have been a part of. So in this sense, Luke is subtly in a different place than Paul himself was. I mean, Paul like doubled down on the shame. I mean, like he's like, you're right. It's foolishness to this world, and of course it's shameful because our Messiah died shamefully on a cross, and that's the way it. Of course it is. So Paul doubles down on shame and humiliation. Luke, he wants to kind of shave some of that off. It's kind of like, well, yes, Paul was a hero, but he did make very important friends and who did support his mission, right? So he does want to make that point. But when the Jews of Thessalonica learned, oh my goodness, they learned that the word of God had been proclaimed by Paul and Berea as well, they came there too to stir up and incite the crowds. Then the believers, Paul and these believers, like clearly Paul's like radioactive. It's like, he's like this radioactive isolate. He's a hot potato. And so the believers immediately sent Paul away to the coast. But Silas and Timothy remained behind. I just find that absolutely fascinating. That it's like, for some reason, Paul just was a lightning rod. And people just, oh my gosh, just focus in on him. And so he has to go. Paul and Silas remain behind. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving instructions to have Silas and Timothy join him, as soon as possible, they left him. So there we have, we get kind of, so Paul gets literally escorted to Athens to get him out of Dodge and to escape the kind of mob action. And I just wanted to read to you, this is again, this is from the first letter of Thessalonians, just to kind of, you can hear, this is the story that Paul is telling more contemporaneously. He says to the Thessalonians, "Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we decided to be left alone in Athens. And we sent Timothy, our brother and co-worker for God in proclaiming the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you for the sake of your faith, so that no one would be shaken by these persecutions." And then you skipped, and then in verse 6 he says, "But Timothy has just now come to us from you," meaning the Thessalonian church, "and has brought us the good news of your faith and love. He has told us also that you always remember us kindly and long to see us, just as we long to see you." It's a really kind of beautiful sort of, kind of Paul's contemporaneous account of his escape, and kind of his note to the Thessalonians saying, you can imagine now that Paul's been on the run, and the fact that the Thessalonians think of him kindly and, remember him well is something that really is a blessing to him. And so he writes back to the Thessalonians from Athens saying, hey, be sure to send Silas and Timothy back. And then they come back, and it's like, oh, I'm so glad to hear about, that you've been doing well. So, so that kind of gets Paul to Athens, and we'll leave it there. So Silas and Timothy are in Macedonia, continuing ministry, and then, as I like to say, Paul is left unattended in Athens. Oh dear, oh dear. I think he's going to get up to some trouble. So, but as John Lewis would say, the reason, may he rest in peace, it was good, is good trouble. So Paul's going to get into some good trouble in Athens as he walks around the city. And so we do get the sense that Paul himself is now in new territory. He's never been. So they have to escort him to Athens because we can infer that Paul doesn't know the way. So Paul himself is now kind of going into regions of the Greco-Roman world that he had never been. Why would he? He was a Pharisaic Jew. Jerusalem's the center of the world. But now Paul is being brought, truly outside his comfort zone, and being brought out into that wider world that the Holy Spirit is driving him out to be a witness to Jesus.